the first interview we did was Shrove Tuesday, and that's the Feast of the Holy Face, and so that leads us, into Lent, and then during Lent, actually every Mass, but we contemplate the Passion of Jesus, and which also Jesus asked Faustina to do, and how important the Passion of Jesus is. And we're going to look at the Passion as revealed in the Holy Shroud. But first, let's look at the Passion itself and why is it so important. Without the Passion of Jesus, we would not have a divine mercy, because that's what we offer up to God, for the sake of your sorrowful passion. Everything begins and ends with the Passion of Jesus. And Jesus said to Faustina, the hour of great mercy, anything will be granted, if only for a moment you contemplate my passion. A lot of people forget that part of it, but to contemplate the passion. So this is how important it is for God, for us to contemplate his passion. Without the passion, God would not be able to incarnate. He would not have an Immaculate Conception. And for that, and by the way, everything here I'm going to discuss, you can find in the Catechism or the Bible. But I point to the Catechism for this, about the Immaculate Conception, the conception of Mary. And yes, God could have done anything he wanted, but he does not normally work outside of his own laws, his own established laws. So what enabled the Immaculate Conception? What enabled God to incarnate into his creation? And let's just go back to Adam and Eve for a moment, because the devil tempted Eve, not Adam. She tempted Eve. Who ate of the fruit first? Eve. What was the fruit? It was a fig, by the way. It wasn't an apple. They made the loincloth out of a fig leaf. And in Jewish tradition, Orthodox tradition, it was a fig leaf. It was a fig, the fruit. But the devil wanted Eve, not Adam. Original sin did not enter mankind when Eve sinned first. It was Eve who sinned first. So the devil was after Eve, wanted Eve to sin so he could corrupt the womb, because they knew God revealed his plan for incarnation, and they wanted to not enable that. So by corrupting Eve's womb, God would not be able to incarnate. So fast forward to the time of Mary. But how was Mary able to be conceived without original sin? Well, the Catechism of the Catholic Church tells us in paragraph 491, the Most Blessed Virgin Mary was, from the moment of her conception, by a singular grace and privilege of Almighty God, and by virtue of the merits of Jesus. What they're saying here is the merits of the Passion of Jesus. So God took the merits of the Passion of Jesus and applied them to the conception of Mary before that event took place, before the Passion took place. And we have to remember with God, there's no sense of time as we're familiar with it. With God, there is only an eternal present, no past, no future. So it was the Passion of Jesus that God gave the grace and enabled Mary to be conceived without original sin. And that's our official Catholic Church teaching. So how important the Passion of Jesus is. Now, the resurrection of Jesus is what made the image on the cloth. I'm not going to get into the technicalities. Was it internal power of the resurrection? Was it external? Did it bounce off the body? As a Catholic researcher, I don't need to see a great white light. At every Eucharist, I believe in transubstantiation. The elements transubstantiate into the body and blood of Christ. I don't recall ever seeing a great white light hitting the Eucharist. So I'm very, very, very pleased that I don't have to accept, because we don't know. We don't know what the power of the resurrection was. But certainly an image was applied to the cloth. And with God, there's no accidents. That image on that burial shroud is no accidental byproduct of the resurrection. There's a reason for that image, and that's what's being unfolded in our time. And there's a message. God gives the world a message for the Holy Shroud. And by the way, I don't have it here, but you can look it up. Catechism of the Catholic Church. The burial cloths enabled the disciples to encounter the risen Christ. So this was to prepare them to encounter the risen Christ. And there's another important element that even the scholars, when they write their footnotes, they don't pick up on, but I'm glad they did. Because what the shroud shows, and this is why the shroud was so very, very important, not just for the Passion, but for us as a Catholic Church. Without the shroud, we would not be where we are today. And what I mean by that is, in Acts of the Apostles, we know Jesus appeared to his disciples, behind closed doors, but he appeared to them and gave them proofs of that he's alive. He presented himself alive by many proofs after his Passion. Now that's plural. Okay? He gave them proofs, not after his resurrection, but after his Passion. So he had something he gave them, okay, to show he had a Passion. And we know from other writings, he gave his burial shroud. Peter ended up with it. But why? Why would he do that? We have to think like a human being, and we have to think like human Jesus, and giving a mission to his human apostles. He knew he had to give them proof that he had a Passion and died, by the way, and rose from the dead in the very same body that he died with. Otherwise, we don't have a resurrection. But yet it was glorified, the same body he died with. But there's one important element that the shroud showed that Peter was able to convince and have 3,000 Jews convert that day. And actually, the apostles, why did Jesus give them his burial shroud? Because he was sending men, among other men or people, men and women, to try and convince them that he rose from the dead. Now, nobody was expecting an individual to rise from the dead. And by the way, that's not what made Jesus Messiah. Okay, that's not what gave him that term, Messiah. Now, our faith is based on, the resurrection, but that's not what gave Jesus the title Messiah. He had to fulfill one very important first century Jewish prophecy to become the Messiah, and he did, and only he did, and the shroud shows that. And Peter had to prove it. So Jesus gave his shroud, his burial shroud, to the apostles. Now, the Sanhedrin, Pharisees, and Sadducees were not expecting any individual to raise from the dead. The Pharisees believed in a general resurrection, but not an individual resurrection. They believed David was to be the Messiah. Now, Peter addresses this, okay, in Acts 2. We jump ahead a little bit. And Peter addressed those who were gathered there and said, my brothers, basically what he's telling them is we're under a false premise, that the Old Testament rabbis taught that David was to be the Messiah. Okay? So now what Peter's doing at Pentecost, he's addressing those Jews who were gathered there, basically saying we were wrong. Okay? David is not, because he mentions David. David is not the Messiah. David died and his bones are with us this day, meaning his flesh corrupted. If flesh gathered around David's bones and he came back to life, we don't have a resurrection. If Jesus died and corruption started and Jesus came back to life, we do not have a resurrection. We do not have a Messiah. He had to fulfill one important prophecy, and he did, and the shroud shows it. What Peter went on to tell the Jews gathered there was that because David was a prophet, you see, David spoke in the singular. Me, you will not allow me to see corruption. You're not abandon my soul to the nether world. Well, the Old Testament rabbis thought that David was to be the Messiah, an eternal living king, physical king. But they were wrong, and this is what Peter's trying to convince them of and to prove. So he tells those gathered there, and he's showing them something. Now, in the shroud, we do see rigor mortis. We see signs of rigor mortis. We see a dead body. Peter had to convince them of one important prophecy, and that's Acts 16:10. He went on to say that David died and his bones are with us today. But David was speaking about Jesus because he was a prophet, and God made a promise to David. So it wasn't David, my brothers, it's Jesus, that it was his soul that God would not abandon to another world, nor would he allow his body to see corruption. That's it, Psalm 16:10. That's the argument that Peter used. And by the way, Paul the Apostle used only that argument too. But how could he prove it? He had to show them the image in the shroud. No sign of putrefaction. Jesus spent less than 40 hours in the sepulchre. The new day begins at sundown. We know there was an eclipse. So they put Jesus in the sepulchre. They had to rush. He was in there. Let's give him 3 hours for day one, 24 hours for day two. That's 27 hours. The Gospels tell us that early on the third day, not that Jesus rose from the dead, but that the tomb was already empty. That's important. But we'll give him 3 hours on day three. We know it was early. Not enough time for the body, for corruption to start. That's what's in our catechism. That's Psalm 16:10. And this is what made Jesus Messiah. That the body, the process did not start. Not enough time for the process to start. He had to raise in 3 days. If we look at John and when he's telling us about the raising of Lazarus, Jesus said, Lazarus, come forth. And Mary, Lazarus' sister, Martha, said, Jesus, maybe you better not raise him because he's been dead 4 days now, and by now he stinks. What a sister, right? But they knew that after 3 days, the process starts. And if that process started, which they're revealing in the raising of Lazarus, they're telling us they have full knowledge that after 3 days, the body corrupts. And if Jesus came back, we don't have a resurrection, we don't have a Messiah. So it couldn't even start. So it had to be 3 days. Now the shroud reveals so much about the passion of Jesus. Between 50 and 75 puncture wounds around the scalp of Jesus. Not a ringlet like we used to see depicted in art. The thorns were like very long. They pierced the skull, hit the bone, and then would wiggle between the flesh and the bone. We really couldn't even imagine that type of pain. The carrying of the cross, the shroud reveals Jesus received very huge splinters sticking in the back of his neck, and he couldn't pull them out. And again, this makes sense. He had a 110-pound cross piece on his back. And with the jostling of the wood and the falling, he received huge splinters in the back of his neck with that rough cut timber. That's revealed in the shroud. Jesus with these falls, now tradition tells us he fell 3 times. We don't get that from the Gospels. But traces of limestone were found on different areas of the face, meaning we know he did fall more than once. He could have fallen a dozen times. But we'll go along with tradition that he fell 3 times. But these falls, remember he had 110 pounds on his back of his cross piece, not the full cross. The full cross would have weighed about 325 pounds. A healthy man couldn't carry a full cross for the distance that Jesus did, which was approximately 650 yards from the Praetorium to Golgotha. He carried his cross piece. That's what the shroud shows. The wounds are smeared over the right shoulder, and the wounds are smeared under the left scapula. Cross piece, 110 pounds. He was tied to it. Now, these falls, he fell on his left knee, slammed it into the ground with 110 pounds on his back, coming down were brutal. The skin on the left knee is ripped open. Now, we see bone fragment, but no bones are broken, so we stay within prophecy. But 110 pounds on his back, slamming that left knee, and that cross piece slamming down on the back of his skull. We just can't picture that. And then Jesus being brought to Golgotha. I'm not going to get too much into what Golgotha means and who's buried there and the skull of Adam. I guess we just don't have enough time. But the shroud reveals Jesus being nailed in the wrist, okay, not in the palm. Many mystics, great mystics and great saints, try to come up with how many times Jesus was struck. In the scourging at the pillar, I know there's over 350 scourge marks, over 200 on the front, 150 on the back. I mean, it's phenomenal. There were 2, maybe 3 different instruments used. First would be a lichter rod, which is a straight rod with splices on the end, like bamboo. And you would whack the body from head to foot. It would break the capillaries, soften the skin, welt up the body, and prepare it for ripping, for gouging with the flagrum. That was like 2 or 3 leather thongs of different lengths with spikes on the end, lead balls, dumbbell shaped. We know the instrument. It's revealed in the shroud. So much more than the physical is, and we have to picture this, is that Jesus was scourged in the nude. Okay? We see the scourge marks on his buttocks, so we know he was scourged in the nude. He would have been bent over to a whipping post because that stretches the back skin. And when they're done ripping you open, they'll stand you up and those wounds close. That process in itself causes excruciating pain. So they scourged Jesus, but so much more than the physical. And picture this for a moment. Jesus, his body being ripped to shreds, and he fulfills the prophecy of Isaiah. Not a sound spot. I will tell you, as a researcher, there is not one sound spot from head to foot. We don't know the extent of his injuries because we don't see the side of Jesus. His arms are down. We don't see the under the arm. So that flagrum wrapped around, hit him, struck him in the chest, loins, but we don't see the side. So no researcher can count the exact precise number of times. But more than a physical, Jesus was scourged in the nude, bent over to a whipping post, in front of his mother, and in front of his friends. And if you could try and imagine this, the humiliation, the embarrassment, there is so much more that we just can't. We just can't imagine it. And then they brought him to Golgotha. I'm not going to go through the whole process, but Golgotha, they nailed him through the wrist. Now Catherine Emmerich has him nailed in the palms. Different, mystics have him nailed different ways. But he was nailed. The shroud reveals the exit wound anyway is in the wrist. He could have been nailed in the base of the palm, but the problem with that is the hand would have bent like this, and you would have smacked the fingers with the hammer. So in all likelihood, right through the wrist, and his fingers would immediately close. And then in Jewish burial, you extend the fingers and then arms down over the loin. So the shroud reveals actually a typical Jewish burial. And then when Jesus decided, after 3 hours, he gave up his spirit, pulling himself up, letting himself down, cramps coming into the body because of the pain on the nerves, uncontrollable shaking, on his cross, sagging down. There was no footrest. Okay? His feet are flat against the upright. We see that in the shroud. We know how his feet were nailed. Pulling himself up, sagging down, all full weight on the nails in the feet and in the wrists. His body convulsing. It would be like being live also with the cramping, with rigor mortis. Okay? And then when he decided, he gave up his spirit. But maybe I'm going to ask right now, I know we're running out of time, but if we could just take one moment and just thank God, contemplate that moment that he died, and give thanks to our good God. Thank you, God. The shroud also reveals between the 5th and 6th rib the introduction of a spear that would have been by a foot soldier, not one on a horse. They knew exactly where the spear went in, pierced, almost cut the heart in half, severed the heart, almost came out the back of Jesus. We see this in the shroud. This is not what killed Jesus, but it's what ensured that we had that definite dead body in order to have a resurrection. It had to be that definite dead body, where it goes against what some scientists would say, well, he was in a coma, and then he came out. That spear, and this is why that's important, that spear severed his heart, and between the fifth and sixth rib. That's how important, and the shroud shows that. The shroud shows the extent of the brutality. But again, the humiliation, the physical pain. So Jesus died, and the bad guy kicked himself. He was wrong. Mankind was redeemed. The moment Jesus died, redemption, we were redeemed. But how, again, how important that holy shroud in the development of our liturgy, in the understanding of the liturgy, our altar cloths represent the burial shroud of Jesus. The burial shroud does not represent the burial cloths. The altar cloths represent, I think I'm saying it right. The altar cloths represent the burial shroud of Jesus. Corporal means body. Once you place the elements on a corporal, the process is about to begin. You're preparing dead elements for life. Transubstantiation, just like the resurrection, takes place within the burial shroud of Jesus. Once you offer up the gifts, place it on a corporal, you can no longer take them off. Without a corporal, you cannot celebrate the Eucharist. Corporal means body. In the year 325, Pope Sylvester decreed the Eucharist will be celebrated on the corporal as if it is the burial shroud of Jesus. And that was in the year 325 by a saint, by a pope. So the Eucharist is celebrated on the burial shroud of Jesus. So we have the development, we have the development of our liturgy. We have our faith. When Peter addressed those at Pentecost, 3,000 were converted that day. And by the way, Paul the Apostle only used that one same argument.
What
They
happened?
They used one argument. Say it again?
No, I'm sorry. There was some interference. I think we're good.
Oh, okay. But Paul the Apostle used only that same argument, Psalm 16:10. The body did not corrupt. Okay? That the focus wasn't the resurrection. The focus was the process of corruption didn't start. Okay? And we find this also in our catechism. But anyway, this is the shroud reveals all this, the extent of the physical pain, and we have to imagine, the embarrassment, the humiliation, being nude, in front of his mother and friends. And they set Jesus on top of huge shards of glass. There's other very deep lacerations on the buttocks of Jesus. Again, nude, and shoving him down on top of these huge shards of glass. They broke the wine bottles on a stump, sat him on a stump on top of these huge shards of glass, and he couldn't get up. He couldn't move. And they mocked Jesus. They embarrassed Jesus. And then Pilate showed Jesus to the people. Just like we see him in a shroud, but minus the nail wounds and minus the spear wound at that time. With his holy body, not a sound spot on his body, ripped shrilly, blood pouring on the ground. Pilate presented Jesus to the people, and they said, have him crucified. So Pilate, being a good politician, sent Jesus out. But the devil did not know God's full plan. He did not know God's plan for redemption. Okay? He did not know that the passion. Now again, how important this is. The hour of great mercy, 3:00, because that's the hour that Jesus died. Why did Jesus die at 3:00? Because that's a time Adam sinned. If we look in Genesis, God went looking for Adam during the breezy time of the day. Now, if you call a Jewish rabbi in Palestine, he will tell you it's 3:00 in the afternoon, because that's when the breeze comes in off the sea in Palestine. It's the breezy time of the day. That's the way you describe the times during the time of Genesis. The heat of the day, the light of the day, the dark of the day, the breezy time of the day, which would be mid-afternoon. But God has a distinct plan, and he stays within that plan. So if you ask me, when will the second coming be? I might guess 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but I'm not going to say the day. I don't know the day, but I would venture to say 3 o'clock. So the devil mimics Jesus, but he did not know God's plan for redemption. He knew God's plan for incarnation, but not for redemption. If you saw the movie The Passion, you saw Jesus when he was being scourged. He collapsed to the ground. He got back up. And I'll tell you, I can picture that. I mean, without looking at history, I could picture that being a real event, because the scourges could not kill you. The Pharisees paid the scourges to do extra damage. The scourges knew the Pharisees were going to have their way. They knew they wanted to have Jesus crucified, and that eventually, because they were very influential, and Jesus would eventually end up being crucified. So they knew what the sentence of death was going to be. So they would not kill you at the scourging. They wouldn't kill anybody at the scourging. Well, they might have to take that individual's place on the cross. You have to die the way you're condemned to death. Same holds true for today. If you're condemned to death by lethal injection, the electric chair, you have to die the way you're condemned to die. So they did not want to kill you. They wanted to weaken you, so you couldn't fight back. So because of the extent of damage on Jesus's body as revealed in the shroud, I could picture that being a real event, that he got back up. Jesus was in very good physical condition. His body weight, according to the shroud, first of all, his body height, according to the shroud, was between 5'10" and a half and 5'11". His body weight was about 175 pounds. And Jesus was very lean. He was very well built. So, in the first century, if you were a carpenter, you also did brickwork, worked with mortar, you worked with heavy timber. So Jesus was in excellent, physical condition. That's why he lasted so long on this cross. The other side of the cross, Jesus was not. We know they cut his ropes because Simon finished carrying the cross of Jesus. So that we know that they cut Jesus loose. We do feel, and the shroud shows, anatomically, the body is perfect, meaning the body measurements in proportion to each other, okay? Except the right arm appears to be longer than the left. And we think what's happening there, there are burn marks on the full length of the shroud on each side. Okay? The shroud was folded at that point, kept in a silver reliquary in Chambéry, France in the 1300s. It was a fire. The fire was so hot, it melted the silver and dripped onto the shroud and caused scorch marks on each side of the image, okay? Now, the Poor Clare nuns were commissioned to sew patches into the shroud in the 1800s before it went to Turin. But the burn marks, because of the burn marks, we don't see the right shoulder. So we feel what happened was, see, when they would lay you down in front of your upright that was already in the ground, typically you were still tied to your cross piece. They would start to nail your left wrist to a pilot hole, a pre-existing hole within this cross piece, and then whack a spike in the wrist, okay, between the ulnar and radius bone. Now, studies have been done where they take cadavers, cut the arms off, nail them through the palm to a wall, start applying weight. Once you reach 80, 85 pounds, this rips through because there's no bone to support the weight. So we believe it was right between the ulnar and radius bone. So they would nail and then proceed to nail your right wrist and line that up with another pilot hole. Now, if it didn't line up, they would cut your rope, wrap it around your hand right here, and pull your arm until it lined up with another pilot hole, and then whack a spike through your right wrist. We feel what happened with Jesus was that what's causing the right arm to appear to be longer than the left is that Jesus' right wrist did not line up with another pilot hole. They took his rope; he was already disconnected, wrapped it around his hand, and pulled his arm and kept pulling until they popped the arm right out of its socket, and then nailed the right wrist. So there was no end. The Orthodox have a tradition that Jesus' head was tied to his cross with a thorn bush. We see evidence of this. And a shroud shows Jesus' right eye is actually ripped in half. And there is a tradition that a thorn pierced the eye of Jesus. Originally, I thought it was from the crown of thorns, but it wasn't. It was from this being tied to the cross. There's indication of thorns running around the full chin, his chin. And he had a chin band on, but we see thorns, in the chin, in front of the chin band. Okay? The chin band was down here to keep the orifices closed. Okay? Coins over the eyes, or lumps of clay, but in Jesus's case, coins. But you would keep the orifices closed, mouth, word, and band. And he had his phylactery on also in death. Anything with blood would have been buried with the body. We see all of this in the shroud. We see the spear, we see the hammer, we see the nails. Anything with blood. Was that typical? First of all, the way Jesus was crucified, yes, for Jerusalem was typical. If you were outside of Jerusalem, if they were in the woods, they would nail you to a cross to the tree, whether they wanted to. There was an individual found, Yehohanan, he was a young man, and they found an olive wood washer with a spike through his ankle. Okay, so his feet were like on each side of this olive tree. All right, and they nailed each side. So each one was unique, but not in Jerusalem where they were crucifying many in a day. The cross would have been Roman tau cross, low to the ground, 6-7 feet, not 12 feet in the air, because it was the soldiers typically who took you down because they might need your cross again. So what they would do is break your legs, take the nails out of your feet, leave you still attached to your cross piece, take you off the upright and chuck you in a pit. With your legs broken, you couldn't run away, and then they would leave you to die. They would walk through Golgotha. Again, these guys were experts. They would walk through Golgotha to see if they needed you upright. They knew who was close to death. They could tell by the gangrene and how much infection, and there were indications of who was close to death. And they would whack their legs, pull the spike out, lift that cross piece up, and then reuse the upright. Wow. And then when your flesh started rotting, they would use these cross pieces again. Golgotha was a filthy, disgusting, rat-infested, disease-ridden area. They did not sanitize like today, even with the guillotine, in France, when they would cut the head, it'd be blood squirting all over the place. And they would throw the heads, and they didn't pay attention, to, I'm not going to say make it clean or nice, but they didn't sanitize, and it was a filthy. So the area itself was a filthy area. You couldn't take the stench of rotting flesh. It was horrible. So nothing about Jesus, by the way, where he came from, part of his passion. Jesus from Nazareth, Jesus of Galilee. When the apostle Philip went to Nathanael, and he said, "We found the Messiah," and Nathanael said, "Who is it?" And Philip said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Nazareth? What good can come from Nazareth? You see, even where Jesus came from, where he was born, where he lived, was a very drug-infested, crime-ridden area. And the Pharisees said, "Galilee, they're a lawless people. The Messiah cannot come from there." So even where Jesus came from went against him. It was part of his passion. Now, by the way, that's why there's no greater intercessor in heaven than Mary, because Mary is the only human being that could say to God, "Look what they did to my and your son." Wow. No human being can say that to God. That's how powerful this is. Look what they did to my and your son, our son, God and Mary. All she knew, she did not know God's plan for our redemption. All she knew that was whatever was taking place was somehow God's will. And that's the faith, that Mary reveals to us, So I like to tell everybody, just take Mary into your heart. One thing I always wanted to do, because I started this when I was 8, 9 years old, and I used to pray to Mary, and I would say, "Mary, I want to know what the passion was like through the eyes of a mother. Because see, I'm not a mother, so it was very hard for me, studying the passion, to see through the eyes of Mary. But then, when you bring Mary into your heart, more is revealed, and these things, make sense. Then you understand the humiliation, the embarrassment,